Jan from Optigo Networks. I am a software developer, and I am presenting to you the router functionality that we have recently released in version 4.4.0.
So today what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at our router and the OneView GUI and how it's changed and advanced now that we have our router, our layer 3 functionality.
The reason why we developed the router is because it helps complete the Optigo solution. So before we had layer 2 networking, so you could set up your VLANs, but you had to use an external router if you wanted to do things such as provide inter-VLAN routing, have a DHCP server, or provide WAN access to an external network. But now you can do that through a fully OneView managed system through a OneView managed router.
So our layer 3 functionality here is just going to allow us to have the availability to only take one IP address off of our IT or the network there, and then we can take control, we can take the independence, and we can do this all ourselves. So we're going to be able to just take that one IP address, and then we're going to be able to create VLANs, we're going to be able to have DHCP scopes and reserve our IP addresses when needed. And all of this stuff that previously we might have had to rely on IT to do, or we might have been able to just do immediately, we might have had to submit tickets. So just allowing us to have all this independence and all this in our own control here.
So OneView will do auto discovery of a router, but one thing to note is that it will only do it if you have a link status notification, right? So if you have the router plugged in already and then you boot up OneView, it won't auto discover the router because it doesn't have a link notification. So what you can do instead is you just go to the config page and you attempt discovery. Can't do it right now because the router is already online, and that's how you get the router online.
So now when we log on to our OneView, what we're first going to see is this here, our unit status page. Now, what we're probably used to on our unit status page is seeing our 3 or 4 counters. Now we're actually going to have 2 extra counters here. So as we're used to seeing our uptime, how long has the system been up, when was the last time we had a power cycle, and we can use that to see was it intended or was that something unintentional and needs investigation. Here now we have our 2 new status, our 2 new unit statuses. They are our router status, so is it online, is it connected, and then do we have WAN, do we have our wide area network, our internet connection, and that is disabled here, but obviously we're able to see quite quickly if it's enabled, if it's disabled, so we'll be able to see fairly handy if we're able to have internet access. So there's our 5 counters. Once again, you're able to jump on and very quickly get a sense of the general health or how everything's working. As we move on down then, we have our router WAN settings. So we can go set up our connection, and we can set up the port, and we can set up if we're going to have a static IP, and we can just configure our outside network, our WAN port or so as we need, and very simply done. Which port we're going to use, and we can have a selection of them, and we decide whether to use static or DHCP.
You can have a DHCP enabled WAN. So right now this is configured DHCP, which means that the WAN port will have a DHCP client on it, and it'll get an address assigned dynamically based on whatever's on the other end, be it your internet service provider or some IT network, for example. But if you have a fixed IP address and you know exactly what it is, you can configure it manually as well. So, for example, if you had something like 180.0.0.20 on the subnet mask 255.255.255.0, and you have 180.0.0.1, you can set that statically, and it'll always have the IP address on the WAN port. So you can see here the WAN port is down because it's not connected to anything, but the WAN settings will still apply to that port when that port is connected.
Go on then to our version. This, once again, is quite similar to as it was before, just we have our software versions and our hardware versions of our devices. Only the router model has been added here now as we have the router device. So we can see here's the model, and here is our MAC address of it.
Kind of useful if you're sending this screenshot to somebody who's asking for, what software you're running and what kind of hardware you have.
When we go down to what was previously our switches, this has now become switches and routers. So the difference here, as you can see, is we have an extra tab that allows us to check on the health or check on our router. So as usual, we have our switches here. As we saw, our 3 out of 4. Here's our one which is offline but had been registered at some stage. We have it offline for testing here and for examples with our demo system.
Once you have your router connected, you can check up on its status, like its CPU memory usage, by going to switches and routers, and then going to the routers tab.
Here we can jump on, we can have a look at our router, our connection is up, and very much the same looking at the switches. We have our options to go investigate and just look at the router health very easily. Our MAC address, our model, and all this can be gotten by clicking more. We jump up and we just seen, we get here all the information we need on our router and on our status.
So this one's got 5% CPU usage, 36% memory usage, and you can ping an arbitrary address from here.
If we want to try ping any addresses and see if we have connection to anything from here as well, which can be very helpful in troubleshooting or trying to locate devices or locate if there is a connection there.
There's also the router ports section. So you can see here, Ether2 is link up.
Here we have our one connection, all the rest are down. This is the link, max link speed they can have. This is working at our max here, so that's very good. We have 100 megabits per second, and then we have that as our aggregation switch connection, which we've labeled.
Which means that this is the aggregation switch connection. So there's up to 3 ports that OneView can use on the router right now. So there's the aggregation switch, the redundant aggregation switch, and then the WAN port. So if I configure a WAN port real quick, you can see that that will show up on here. And there you go. It says WAN. It's linked down, so it's not going to really do anything, but it shows that this is the port that was used for WAN. And then when you click into more, you can see the counters and the bandwidth usage of the port.
So once again, we can go and look in a little bit more information and see some of the receiving and transmitting stats of our device and of our ports, see how many frames are going. And once again, error and discard frames are the two things we want to make sure that we don't get them too high. So long as they remain low, we're probably doing fairly okay. Now we move on to one of the real advantages, or one of the real areas where this router and so is going to come into very handy for us.
All right, and this is where you will do the bulk of your router configurations. You got your VLANs and subnets.
So we'll see here, we have 4 VLANs that we've created. We have sample, example 1, and sample 2, and then we have our management VLAN. Now we actually can edit these if you've done yourself, gone through the CLI, or you've had to go through a situation where you are trying to configure ports. You'll know that you can interface range. We can do a config on a range of ports, but to do port 3, 7, 14, and 9, something like that, it's going to be much more one by one. And in doing that, if we have a large number of ports and we're trying to switch them all over from VLAN 10 to 15 here, we have to do that one at a time. If that takes 20 minutes, there's a 20-minute gap where the first port can't contact the 20th port. There is a effective downtime or so. Whereas here, we can jump on, we can just simply 15, save, change, and all of our ones across the board are all just changed immediately. From the sample goes from 10 to 15 there. I haven't saved that, but just easy as we don't have to worry about even reducing the possibility of human error, as if we have to do something 20 times, or if we have to do it once, it's much more likely we're going to get it right once.
So you can only have 1 VLAN per subnet. So here we have the management VLAN, which is on VLAN 10, and a nice functionality that OneView provides for you is it will auto-complete your fields for you with defaults. So if I just select 65,000 here, it'll give me a subnet that is free for use. So if I save this right now, which I won't because it's the management VLAN, but if I save it, this wouldn't conflict with anything. And then the DHCP range is also filled out to the maximum usable addresses, but you can change this to be only a subset, so maybe 10.4.0.200. So I only have what is this, about 198 or so addresses instead of the full 65,000 range. But of note is that the router will still route on the entire subnet. It just won't serve dynamic DHCP addresses on the entire subnet. And you can even have a DHCP range that is empty, and this won't disable the DHCP server. What it will do is it will configure it so there's only static IP addresses that will get served. So basically only reserved IP addresses will be served, but the DHCP server is still alive. And any device that is requesting a DHCP lease that doesn't have a reserved IP address will not be given an IP address. So, for example, if I have the device that has MAC address L7s and I give it, if I reserve 10.4.100.100 for it with an empty DHCP range, this will get this IP address. But if I had a MAC address that was, for example, all 8s, this device would not be served an IP address because this DHCP server is static only. Creating a new VLAN. So if I create a new VLAN, but its address range will be given 10 dot something, and then it'll just increment based on the second number here. So if I created a new one, it would create 10.4 dot something. Right, so let's just create new VLAN. Give it VLAN. I think 150 wasn't used. Let's give it my favorite color, pink. And 1024 addresses. So a good choice of a default number if you don't know how many you need is 1024. It's not too many, not too few. But if you know exactly what you need, just go ahead and select which one. So notably, 65,000 is the max that we support. We don't think that you'll need any more than that, but feel free to let us know if you do, and we can see if we can accommodate you. So you can see here, as I said, it gave the 10.4 address, which doesn't overlap with any existing system or any existing subnets. And I can go ahead and save that.
So here we have the choice of how we want to define our network section of the IP address. So we can change that easily enough. We'll change that to 5 if we want. You see here, our default gateway automatically is defined. We have the subnet mask showing us that it's a /22 here, and actually explaining to us even here it could be used somehow, being helpful for anyone who's new as well, for actually learning these phrases and things. And then usable addresses will be displayed to us here. So we now have our usable addresses, and we have our entire range. We can reserve addresses here if needs be. Obviously, we have some devices that are going to have statics, and we don't want any collisions by DHCP issuing out a static address. So here we have our MAC and static, and we can reserve an IP address for a specific MAC. And then, obviously, that's not going to be leased out to anyone else. Very easy to create a VLAN, very easy to allow communications between VLANs, and very easy to allow internet access. Very much clicking buttons, very much just kind of plug and play for registering stuff. Clicking one or two settings here, turn on an internet access or allow communication, really taking the tediousness and the complex commands and the risk of doing it wrong is all kind of removed here. When we move down to our inter-VLAN routing, this is a very, very handy and very efficient way of just allowing communication between our VLANs.
By default, all of your VLANs are fully isolated from each other as if it was purely layer 2 network, but you can allow connections between VLANs.
Now you'll know yourself as well, CLI and doing this on the configuration can be a lot more tricky, it can take a lot more steps. Whereas here, if we have sample VLAN, I might want to allow communication with sample 2. All I click is add sample 2, and now the two of them have communication with each other.
So what I've done there is I've configured it so that management and CCTV are allowed to communicate to each other. So the router will enable these two VLANs and subnets to talk to each other, which is great.
And as you can see down at the bottom, this is added here as well. Now the key difference is if I decide to add example 1 as well, sample can now contact sample 2 and sample can contact example 1. However, you can see here example 1 can only contact sample. It is not that all of them are being allowed to communicate with each other. It's not all open like that. We can specifically allow communication between 2 and block them off between others. Once again, you're getting that whole functionality, as much functionality as you would be able on the CLI, but just much easier, taking a lot of the tediousness and the unnecessary commands out of it for OT. If we were then to move down further, we have our WAN access. So if we do want the VLAN to have internet communications, maybe we don't want it to have because there's no need for it. We don't want anyone to be able to come in, same as that, or maybe we just have different areas that we do want somewhere to be able to contact something externally. We do have something like that. Easily for that, we can just turn on our connection.
you just enable access for a VLAN and subnet to access the WAN network, whatever that may be, whether that's some other isolated network or whether that's an internet connection. It'll provide access out of there using network address translation.
Possibly we have someone wanting to remote into a laptop, and they might also at the same time want to be able to connect to their devices. So we can allow communication from the internet into the VLAN with the device, and then we can allow communication from the VLAN with the device, our laptop, to our controller. So, and then we don't actually have any direct communication from the WAN into our controller. Just allow that little bit of extra security. So in these, it can be used in many different ways, and it can be very, very helpful for just setting these up nice and simply.
It does what your router at home does, basically, for giving you an internet connection. The last section of this page is the DHCP leases, which you can see here. There's two devices on the CCTV VLAN and subnet, and they are, you can see their host names are CAM14 and CAM15, and their lease type is dynamic, which means that they are not reserved. One thing you can do from this menu is select your devices that you want to reserve, and you can go ahead and reserve them right from here. So do you want to configure your dynamic IP as static? You can say yes. And now when they get configured, you'll see that it's waiting, but now it's reserved. So when they get set in the router, the router will kind of assume that, well, it basically doesn't know that the device was there beforehand because you kind of overwrote the dynamic lease. But when the device's lease is approaching expiry, it'll request a new one, and then this will show up. So it'll probably take a few minutes before this becomes bound to that device again. Okay, so I'm going to do an IP scan and see if we can discover that that router that is, or not that router, that what's it called? See if we can discover this camera that's on here. So they're on the 10.3 subnet, 10.3.0 even. 10.3.0.200, and the VLAN was 200. All right, so what this is doing is it's sending ARP messages on this subnet and VLAN, and it's also discovering MAC addresses on the switch ports. So it does a combination of both. So it'll always find whatever MAC addresses are currently on those ports, but it likely won't find every IP address that is on your network. So once this completes, we'll hopefully see those cameras. Oh, 3 IP addresses were found. So it probably found the router as well. So let's go to port VLAN 200. And yeah, so you can see here there's 4 MAC addresses. These ones also seem to be cameras, but they're not requesting DHCP leases right now. And if I refresh this, hopefully the host names show up on this page. Is that going to be the case? Okay, they show up there. So when you enable the collection settings, this will periodically gather information from the router as well, and it'll get information from the router for these like these IP addresses. So notably, anything that is not requesting DHCP addresses will not be discoverable through that feature. Anything that is getting a DHCP address from the router will periodically be updated on here. You can also see your devices and IP addresses on this page. Let's go ahead and check on these VLANs Subnets, see if they got bound. Oh, okay, one of them has been bound. So this device has requested a new lease, and now you can see that this lease duration is at 9 minutes and 50 seconds. And I think that's everything I want to talk about.
Same as it had been before with the switches. Before the router came in, we've kept this all consistent, kept this all very similar, and just added the extra features of the layer 3. So as you can see there, it's very much kind of handy, intuitive. A lot of the ways we have with some of our switches or so, we're just trying to make it as easy as possible, taking out the unnecessary bits that maybe might be required in OT, but not in, maybe required in IT, but not in OT. As you can see there, we're just able to very simply configure and make our edits. Thanks very much for listening. If you have any other questions on the routers or so, please feel free to contact us at Optigo. We're always more than happy to help. More than happy to take a bit of feedback and create another video if needs be.